All right. So I'm not going to tell you any more about me. Rob did a lovely job. You can read more about me on the internet, the interwebs, LinkedIn, and so forth. So let's get started. So again, with respect to the annual theme, as Rob mentioned, there's all sorts of aspects of serendipity, the personal ability to make yourself accessible to it, the opportunities to delight in it. I'm going to take a bit more of a mercenary approach and say, what are the economics of serendipity, applied serendipity, if you will, and how can we actually leverage serendipity in service of our innovation pipelines? I think as designers, we have the opportunity and in some cases the obligation, depending on where you are in the organization, to actually design into our experiences opportunities for serendipity. And so, as Rob suggested, there's productization opportunities, and as I'll talk about tonight, ways to enable serendipity. But again, my focus is going to be on its relationship to innovation. Before I get into all of that, though, I'd like to just take a moment and recognize that all of us here, hopefully all of us here, unless we're aliens and weren't on the planet 3 years ago, have experienced something that's actually pretty profound and rarely happens to all of us across the entire globe. So I want to take a moment of silence to recognize what's happened to us over the last several years and think about and reflect on what we've lost, what we've gained, and what we've learned. My wish for all of us is that the last 3 years will have been the worst thing that will ever happen to us in our lives. So thank you for that. But all of us, as Rob also mentioned, even Kai-Fu is thinking about the future and moving towards joy. All of us are starting to orient ourselves towards these now times as opposed to the before times. And our organizations are really stressed, as you probably have noticed, both in the media and even with personal experience. The leadership inside organizations are having a lot of difficulty navigating this new time, this new place. We're having trouble coming up with narratives and stories that suggest why we should be coming back into the office, for example. And so the return to office problem, challenge, opportunity is looming pretty large for a lot of organizations. So we have I don't have my screen. We have what, 35, 30 some folks. So I do want to open this up for a little bit of engagement. Let's go back to the before times. Let's say somewhere in the 2019 timeframe, early 2020 at the latest. If you were working in an office, name one thing that comes to mind, and we can do this out loud, I think, unless you've muted everybody, then do it in chat, and some folks can just, maybe I'll bring the chat up. Let's see if I can get the chat up. Yeah. Hold on a second. I think what I'm sharing, I don't actually have access to the chat window. Let's see, hold on. One moment.
One of us can read it for you as well if you want, so.
There it is. Now I have everything in front of me. Okay, show the chat. Okay, good. I got it. So name one thing that you found positive about coming into an office with other human beings if you were working in an office back in 2019, 2020. One thing. I'm sure there were hundreds of things that people thought were positive, but just drop it into chat. What was one thing? Excellent. Nice. Yes. As Rob will attest, when we were at Intel, our team was known by our glasses and shoes, sometimes by our hair. Excellent. Beautiful. Yeah. I don't know that anybody really thinks about it until they've come back into the office now, but it's not just seeing faces, it's seeing people's backs. People actually have backs. It's really kind of interesting. We're three-dimensional. We hardly ever notice that until we're actually back in the office. It's really odd. Okay, good, good. Now, I'm assuming by the middle to end of 2020, everybody who's here who was working was probably working remotely. Is that a fair, unless you were an essential worker? My presumption is you were probably working remotely. Uh, Tell me one thing that you found really positive about working remotely. One of the things I noticed as a metadata point was how quickly we could come up with joyous things working remotely and how much longer it took to come up with things from home, from working at the office. I'm not going to put too much merit or that, but we're certainly getting a lot of joyous responses of working remotely. Okay, very cool. For folks who are now being asked to come back to the office, assuming you are working for an organization that has an office, when was the first call to return to the office? When do you remember being first told it's time to come back to the office? Ooh, nice. 2021. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 And as those responses are coming in, what was the basic ask? What was the narrative? What was the expectation when your organization was saying come back? So Matt Adams put in 3 days a week. Yep, good. Other folks had other timeframes like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. Very cool. All right. In this extremely unscientific but highly valid questionnaire, because assuming you're not lying, these are things that actually happen to you. So we can't say they're predictive of the population, but we can say that they happen to you. These actually mirror quite closely the future of work investigations that we did at athenahealth with our own employees, and I'll get into some of that as we move into the material. But I want to reflect on several of the themes that I saw coming up, which I think are consistent with not only our own research, but a lot of stuff that's being published in a variety of locations. First of all, I think we've all become quite seduced and engaged with the flexibility that working from home has afforded us. So we saw responses like being able to spend time with our family, being able to do laundry and have a meeting at the same time, walk the dog and engage in work at the same time, decide to eat the food we'd like to eat as opposed to whatever is available to us, get up out of our home office chair, go do something else, come back and not have that commute time to worry about. So flexibility turns out to be a really, really difficult barrier to overcome as we're asking folks to consider coming back to the office. And then, although I didn't prompt you for this, I think it's fair to assume that there are also quite a few negative impacts of having been working remotely. Some of that is reflected in the positives of coming into the office, but we heard quite a bit of, and we know from the statistics, a lot of mental health issues have emerged in the last 3 years. Significant depression, isolation, alienation, and certainly a lack of connection to the culture of our organization, which for many of us has been the reason we wanted to join an organization, was because of their mission or the culture and working together towards a united goal. So that's a problem. We've also been exploring and reflecting on our privileges. Some of us have residences that allow us and our partners and our families to coexist, even as we're trying to do these generally not mutually acceptable kinds of work. Others share a one-bedroom apartment or a three-bedroom apartment with other roommates who don't have the luxury of going into separate rooms and whose schedules require everybody to be working at the same time. So privilege has come up as an interesting factor for us to consider as we think about the future of work and return to office. And then the really, really wonderful and other sort of impacts that at least weren't apparent to this guy, but were certainly clear to others, is the great leveling that working remote has done in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So where folks who might be discriminated against merely by their stature, there's been a great leveling because we're all sitting in chairs now. And so we no longer have this microaggression of speaking literally over people's heads because we can when we are standing in the office. But larger and more impactful or equally impactful are folks with disabilities who now have access to meetings that they otherwise might have had more difficulty attending, underrepresented folks who now have greater opportunities to be present, again, for reasons that are in some ways, the democratization of access through remote technologies. Not all great, certainly not a solution that we can all cheer and say, yay, but a definitely demonstrable difference that remote work has made on DEI efforts. So you take all of that, and now you start looking at the return to office, and offices are actually smaller now if your organization has gotten their act together and they've let go of a bunch of real estate because they know that we're never going to get 100% or 70% or 90% occupancy like we used to do. And we might be down to 30 or 40%. So they're shedding real estate because that's a cost. That's one of the second highest costs, operational costs. So now we're returning to an office that doesn't have our own desk. And so we're going to be sharing desks and a lot more coordination with conference rooms that may have greater pressure on them. So we're entering into a new set of challenges as our leaders are asking us to come back. So all of that is the result of this supernova that occurred in early 2020. And the echoes and reflections of that are continuing to come out from that point source explosion. Today's talk is about one tiny little reverberation that is part of that set of echoes. So earlier in the year, a lot of us were asked to come into the office for a very specific reason. We had won a contract with a very large client, and this was going to be the kickoff of a multi-year engagement with that client. And so all the big wigs from our company and from the client's company were going to come in, and then all of the chain of command and staff below each necessary to help drive that were also invited. So there were several activities with a capital A planned for this all-day event. They were going to tell us the story of their company in an activity called a share out, capital S, capital O, and we were going to do the same. And then we were going to have lunch together in an informal social interaction, capital I, capital S, capital I, and then we were going to move into a set of workshops known as formal collaborative engagement, capital F, capital C, capital E. But many of us had come in earlier in the week to get prepared for this event. And so we were engaged in a whole bunch of informal collaborative engagements, capital I, capital C, capital E. And this is one of those engagements that I was involved in. A buddy of mine said, hey, can you join me in the office? I want to walk through what I'm going to be talking to the group tomorrow about, and I want your feedback on it. I said, great. His was a 10-minute commute in. Mine was 6 hours plus the prior day. So I had come in, he had come in. We're in a conference room, pretty standard conference room, table, screen, had a beautiful little glass opening out into the open area, and he begins his share out, capital S, capital O. We get a little bit into it, and he talks about a new feature that his team is going to be building out that is going to be interesting for this group the next day. And my ears pick up, and I go, wait a second. And so we shifted from him doing a share out into this informal collaborative engagement, capital I, capital C, capital E. And all of a sudden, I say, wait a second, we already built that capability. We did that last year for a whole different reason. He goes, wait, what? That's our job. Like, that's what we do for a living. You guys built that? I don't know anything about it. Tell me more. What do you do? And I said, I can't tell you a lot of the details of it because I wasn't involved in the low-level details, but the functionality you're talking about, yeah, we built that like 6 months ago. And I looked through the glass and I said, hey, the guy who actually designed that is sitting right outside. Why don't I introduce you? So we got up and we went outside the conference room to this open area, which didn't quite look like that, but it's close. And I made the introductions. Now, he had no reason to know my team member, but my team member probably had reason to know him. He's a pretty high visibility guy. He's another UX director. So while they may have been aware of each other and my team member may have been aware of him, they had absolutely no reason to talk to each other. He's in a completely different product line, blah, blah, blah. I introduced them. I stepped away. I let them work through whatever the hell went on there. They both looked like they were smiling and happy, and away we went. And I think as the theme of the year has underscored, serendipity is often so small that it's hardly even recognized, that it's truly in the fabric of just being, and that sometimes you just have to be sensitive to it to even know that it's gone on. And this is one of those random collisions that occurred. And I thought this was notable enough that I actually sat down and wrote an article about it because it was so profoundly different from what we had been doing for the prior 2 years. But it was nothing at all. It was really very nothing at all. And yet its impact is very much outsized. And it's dependent on a whole bunch of infrastructure that had to be in place for that to happen. And that's the really strange thing about random collisions, which is the word we're using, the activity, capital R, capital C, that is associated with these serendipitous occurrences in the workplace. They look consequential, but they're anything but. So I want to walk you through and deconstruct this particular random collision through a set of lenses. Okay, so 3 elements had to be in place for that random collision to occur. First is we had to be in the same place at the same time. So same physical place, same time. Second, the physical environment needed to be designed in a way that enabled us to do that. If my team member hadn't been outside in some other place, that would not have been as nearly as serendipitous. If I didn't know that he was just outside the conference room, also very difficult to know. And then the third element is somebody in that triad needed to know what the other 2 were working on and had to make that connection. That happened to be me in this case. So I'm going to break down each of those elements as part of this conversation to show that while it seems like a little bit of fluff that actually occurred, there's a huge set of deep structures going on that actually makes that happen. And we're going to start with this idea called activity-based work, capital A, capital B, capital W, and I will stop doing that annoying thing now. So I'm going to read for the transcript, what's the quote here? A transition to activity-based working provides the perfect opportunity to create alignment between the design of the office and the organizational culture. Effective workplaces should have positive impacts on culture. Veldhoen and Company. So Eric Veldhoen and Company is an architecture group originally out of the Netherlands, now headquartered in New York. And they published their initial work on ABW back in 2002. And they based it on the work of an American architect by the name of Robert Luchetti, who coined the term back in the 1970s. And activity-based work, as this quote attempts to talk about, really says that for any given workplace, there is a set of activities that the occupants expect to get done there. And if you're familiar with Tony Ulwick's Jobs to be Done, it's different from that. It's bigger than that. It's closer to the notion of architectural programming. So in architectural programming, the architect sits down with the client and says, okay, so what do you want to do in this building? And the client says, I need a room where 100 people can sit. Okay, so we know how many square feet per person we need to allot to that room. That gives us the square footage. But we still don't really know what you're going to do there. What are you going to do in that room? Is it going to be an amphitheater? Is it going to be sage on the stage? Is it going to be people talking to each other? Is it going to be a universal manipulable? What do you want to get done? And that's when we start to get into the deeper aspects of programming. If you go with activity-based working, you start to ask questions about why. Why are you doing that work? And why are you choosing to do that work in that space? Knowing the rationale behind those activities helps designers better make those spaces fit for purpose. So this white paper, which this quote is from, I have access to it. I'm happy to email it to you. I would be more than happy to send you a link to it. Unfortunately, it's not easily available off their website, but I'm sure they would be happy to email it to you. I'll save you the trouble. Reach out to me either at Phase 2 Design or through LinkedIn, and happy to get you the paper. So let's take a look at what happened to the three of us in that arrangement earlier this year through this activity-based lens. All right, my associate, my buddy, and I are sitting in that conference room. He's doing a share out. Meanwhile, my team member is sitting outside doing individual focused work. At time 2, I shift the conversation based on something that caused this to go on, and we're leaning in and we're doing a little bit more collaboration. Meanwhile, my team member, unbeknownst, doesn't even know we're there probably, continues to do his individual focused work. I have this aha moment. I say to my buddy, wait, what? He says, wait, what? And we look through the glass and I go, that guy. We get up, we walk out. Random collision occurs. I step away. The two of them move into an informal collaborative engagement. So if we start to look at how work is done in the office through this activity-based work lens, then we can begin to optimize for these different types of activities. And we can then begin to design workspaces to enhance opportunities for things like random collisions. And in fact, this diagram on an endless PowerPoint plane is not where activity-based work occurs. It occurs in a real space. And as it happens, the space we were in was a space that I had designed with help as part of the Future of Work labs. So this is Lab D. And there are 6 labs, and we had set these labs up for the intentional purpose of testing our hypotheses about enabling activities in the workplace that are more easily done co-located than can be done remotely. But more critically, we created these labs to allow fluidity between those key activities so that individuals could move from one type of activity to another with as little friction as appropriate. So my buddy and I were sitting in this conference room. I don't know if you can see it off to the right with my cursor. And my team member was sitting, actually, these were not set up as individual workstations like this. They were rolling conference tables. So he had a bunch of stuff laid out on a bunch of conference tables. So his back to us, but we could see him through the glass. So that each of these labs was set up with different furnishings and different equipment and different technologies to help test these hypotheses about what kinds of arrangements would enable this fluidity. So in a plan view, you can see that my buddy and I were doing individual informal collaborative engagement. My team member was doing individual focused work. The random collision occurred actually in the room when I had this aha moment, but I made the introduction outside. There's an entire presentation about this that I gave to the Portland Design Thinkers literally a year ago on this entire topic, and I invite you to listen to it. We go deep into activity-based work. We talk about the future of work effort, and we talk about our experimental methods. We, the royal we, me. I talk about our experimental methods and what we actually did, and I'll drop a link into that video at the end in chat. So, step one, we were all in the same place at the same time. That space was actually designed to do the sorts of things that would enable random collisions. And so, yay, the Future of Work Lab actually worked in this case. Hooray for us. Great. End of talk. What I'm saying is everybody should come back to the office so that they can bump into each other. Yeah, no, that's not what I'm saying. Well, it is kind of what I'm saying. But the real thing here is that organizations and their leadership really need to figure out the right narrative so that folks will come back to the office to do the right thing. So in your list of reasons as to why, exactly, in the list of things as to why you've been told to come back to the office, right? Teamwork, right? It's better because we have cross-team communication, works better in the, yeah, okay, great. Lots of interesting attempts to describe what is going on in a co-located space that is different from remote. But the Future of Work team actually, we think we actually figured it out. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. One of the key insights that our task force came up with that we provided to our leadership, again, earlier in the year before this particular engagement, a month or two earlier, was really framing the return to office messaging around supporting those key activities that are absolutely crucial to enhance and accelerate our innovation pipeline. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that story in a moment. So Jim Callbeck knew that I was going to be giving this talk. He sent his apologies. He couldn't attend, but he said, you really ought to listen to this guy because he's talking about very similar stuff. And so I did, and I went, oh, good, I'm going to incorporate it into the talk. So I'll send a link to his video also at the end. But this is Michael Arena. And for those who don't know Michael, he's was ex-head of talent for GM and vice president at Amazon and is a dean of studies at a variety of colleges. Great talk that he gave recently on this very topic. The struggle that leadership is having in framing our return to office narrative. And he's pretty bold. He says it's kind of nonsense to say, get back into the office 2 days a week. It's not only meaningless, it's actually counterproductive. And in the studies that he's referring to, where Microsoft did a lot of deep dives on this, he says, look, if you bring people back in the office for 2 days a week, you have about a 4% improvement in, let's talk random collisions or innovative ideas. You have about a 16% chance of building teams better, and that cross-team stuff. And then there's approximately a 16%, a little less than 16% chance that you'll actually influence the stakeholders you need to influence better than if you could do remotely, but only if you're near them. But it all comes at a cost of about a 20% drop in productivity. So you have to make this sort of decision. You want to just bring people in for 2 days a week and actually lose some value because you've dropped productivity for not quite the same gain in some of these other areas. He's suggesting that would be a rather dumb thing to do. And we had a slightly different take on a similar theme. We said, why would we want to bring people back into the office when it wasn't all that great before the pandemic? So how is it going to be any better now? Like, shouldn't we actually make the office a better place than it was? And shouldn't we actually be addressing all the DEI issues that we knew about before the pandemic and somehow change our ways in the physical plant? So there were lots of reasons not to just bring people back to the office. We really needed to rethink the office. Now, the other interesting point that Arena's presentation is great, by the way, and I urge you to go listen to it, but there's another theme in there that I want to pivot towards that he's underscoring. He talks a little bit about an engagement model that is very similar to what we were talking about in the future of work, although we talked about it in terms of activities. He's talking about it in terms of this kind of design thinking sequence. And you'll note that there are this sort of ebb and flowing if you think about the top of each of the circle versus the bottom of each of the circle. And what he's saying is at the top of those two discovery and diffusion circles, you really should be building bridging connections. These are connections with folks you don't usually work with. When you're doing discovery, you want lateral thinking. You want to get outside the box. You want to talk to other folks. And when you're doing diffusion, that's when you're actually trying to get other folks to know about the work you're doing. And those aren't the people you did the work with. They already know about that. So you need to get outside your current network to diffuse those ideas. And those are called bridging connections. The ones that are below on the lower part of the circle, he talks about as bonding connections. And those are ways in which, geez, you have this really interesting idea. It's time to build it. You want to get together with your team and build it. But it doesn't mean you have to get together in real space to do that. We've been able to work quite well as teams remotely if we have a solid idea of what we're supposed to work on. And similarly with the delivery, we get through all the design stages and blah, blah, blah. Now we actually have to get it to market. Once again, we need heads down work to do that. So he makes these distinctions between bridging and bonding connections. And he bases a lot of that on these notions of network graphs. So I'm going to pivot to the next big piece of that random collision outside of the physical plant was the fact that I kind of knew what my buddy was doing, and I sort of knew what my teammate was doing, and I acted as a node within that network. And so to do that, I'm going to get a little geeky, even more geeky than I already am, and I'm going to go into the notion of network graphing. So late in 2020, maybe early 2021, the task force actually we were reading like hundreds of articles and just absorbing all sorts of stuff. And this study came by from Microsoft and MIT that they had published based on looking at the impact of the lockdown on Microsoft's innovation funnel. And what they'd done is taken pre-March 2020 data based on Microsoft employee badging data and June 2020 data based on Microsoft Teams online interactions. And they ran it through, they had millions of data points, and they ran it through their network graphing system. And what they found was quite disturbing to them. So in order to understand the impact and what those mean, I'm going to use a beautiful Harvard Business Review article that goes into the sort of archetypal network graphs that help explain things like innovation. So in each of these graphs, you'll see a purple node and an orange node. The purple node represents the individual who is an archetype of the signature, and the orange node is one who is counterfactual to that archetype. So we have two interesting signatures here, the ideation signature. This is at the individual level. In the ideation signature, we have a purple node who actually has lots of other folks in their network, and those other folks don't talk to anybody else in the purple node's network. That is, very few of them talk to the other people that the purple node is connected to. In that way, the purple node gets to be in the center of a lot of ideas. Notice the orange node is very well connected to a lot of people, but they all talk to each other. Therefore, the potential for diversity of ideation is lower for the orange node in the ideation signature. Similarly, in the influence signature, the purple node has access to loosely coupled nodes, again, clusters that don't talk to one another, whereas the orange node is only talking to singletons, or in one case, a loosely clustered group. The purple individual is in a much better position to influence both of those other clusters than the orange node is. So that's the first at the individual layer. The article goes on to talk about the team layer. Teams that are highly efficient have lots of interconnections between each other, and obviously they have connections outside as well. But the innovation signature has a very loosely coupled set of connections with the team, and the team has strong connections outside to these clusters. Therefore, they can bring ideas and capabilities and diverse, not just ideation, but getting those ideas to market requires a whole bunch of other teams doing other things. These team members have access as a team to a lot more resources than the efficiency signature. So the article goes on to look at it at the organization level. There's this interesting sort of anti-patterns that start to emerge. We get to the silo signature in organizations. This is where clusters of folks aren't talking to each other very much, maybe connected with very impoverished connections. And any one of the nodes that is the singleton connection, if they leave, those clusters no longer are aware of each other. That is not a good situation to be in. And then in the vulnerability signature, the organization has contracts with external suppliers, let's say, or folks who are not even part of the organization. Same problem. If they're only linked with a few number of folks, if any one of those folks leaves, they've severed that opportunity to connect. So in Michael Arena's conversation, he talks about those connections. He talks about these connections up here as bonding connections. And he talks about these connections as bridging connections. So innovation depends on bridging connections. Productivity depends on bonding connections. This becomes important because what the Microsoft study found is that their ideation and innovation signatures were all collapsing between January and June into the efficiency signature. All of the bridging connections were dying off because they're very hard to maintain remotely. Arena goes into this in a little more depth because he's referring to exactly the same study, which is fantastic. But he's done a bunch of other work and has a lot of other data. So if you're only going to look at this through a productivity lens, you're missing this really critical impact that remote work has imposed on us. And this is what Microsoft was very worried about. And this is what our leadership was very worried about because they had also read the study. And the problem with innovation cycles are they can be extended. They can be as long as 3 years. So I think we used to say at Intel, or one of the places I used to work, we're eating our own seed corn. Like we are now eating our future. And we don't have anything left when we emerge 3 years later. The innovation pipeline is empty. This was freaking Microsoft out, like so much that they were actually starting to talk about setting up WeWork satellite offices in some way to re-energize that innovation cycle. So we sounded the alarm as well. And this was very early on. This is mid-21. And we said, all right, let's figure out what we're going to do as part of this future of work task force to look into this innovation problem. So back to me and my teammate and my buddy, right? There I was, that connector node between these two folks who didn't know anything about each other, but were actually working on the same idea. That's the opportunity for random collision if I'm keeping my ears open and my eyes open. And another thing about productivity, if teams are saying they're being more productive, which, by the way, when we interviewed a bunch of folks at the office who had not come into the office ever since the start of the pandemic, either they were employees before and had chosen to never come back in the office, or they were hired after the lockdown and had never come into the office. They all reported that their productivity was up. Yay! But we also learned that there were several teams working on the same problem unbeknownst to each other. So everybody's working at a higher productivity, but they're all working on the same problem. So you have to divide it by the number of teams. Are they actually more productive? Because they're actually not sharing out the fact that they're working on these problems, right? So we start to question what productivity means in a siloed organization. Okay. Now we can all talk about how we can get collaborative work done remotely. And I know we've all done it. We've all been doing it. And there are certainly lots of tools that some to greater and some to lesser extent, help us do that. But I also know, at least in my own experience, that when you're in person and you're actually in the room and you're actually doing something, there's a whole dimension that suddenly comes out that has been stripped from these technology, digitally intermediated kinds of experiences. As I mentioned, you suddenly see that people have backs. Like there's 3 dimensions to people, but it goes beyond that, as you've said in your list of stuff. Just seeing people wave their arms in real space sends a whole different message to you from across the room. I submit that at least one of the degradations that occurs is this lack or loss of this key activity, random collisions. All right. So that's the network graph problem, which turns out to be really, really critical. So the Future of Work team wrapped up their stuff at the end of last year. We reported out to the top brass, and we said, here's a framework we want you to start thinking about when you build your return to office playbook. There are 4 key influencers or drivers that every employee has some more or less impact. And it's productivity, flexibility, innovation, and culture. Every employee is in some way invested in some proportion of those 4 things. So the return to office playbook needs to play off of those drivers if we're going to actually make sense and resonate. I mentioned, the flexibility that our employees felt and were seduced by, huge cliff to overcome, major bar to overcome. The commute, major bar to overcome. We're going to ask people to come in and they're going to take 2 hours out of their life on a highway, and then they're going to be forced to be there and not eat the snacks that they actually enjoy at home and miss their dog and family. Like, that's a big deal. Like, that's not a small or trivial thing. So we better have a really good reason to come in. The other side of that we felt was the key balance against flexibility was this innovation message. We have a very strong culture around innovation. It's really important to us. It's part of our brand. And so we felt that we needed to tell a story that both addressed the flexibility seduction and gravity well of flexibility and how to get folks out of that in service of maintaining our innovative culture. So it turns out when you break down innovation through an activity-based work lens, you find out that one of the key contributors to innovation is collaboration, which is why you're hearing in your return to office stuff a bunch of things about working with teams and da-da-da-da. It's really ultimately about getting those ideas to flourish. And as Rob can attest to the work that we did at Intel, we had a dedicated team of 12 folks for a year trying to unpack what it meant to be collaborative remotely. It was back in 2013. So we knew that it's really hard to collaborate. Like, it's really hard to collaborate. At Intel, it's particularly hard to collaborate. But anywhere, it's hard to collaborate. It's really hard to collaborate remotely. Like, that is a really difficult barrier that you suddenly put in place. So if you really think you want to do innovation, then you really have to buy into collaboration. And since collaboration is another cultural mainstay of our company, we really felt like we were getting a twofer here, right? If we were able to tell the story of coming in to innovate and also to be collaborative, these would be counterbalances to the seduction of flexibility. So what are the activities that are contributing to innovation that are better done in the office versus remote? So we did that analysis, and that's what a bunch of our work out of the experiments indicated to us. Some of these activities are highly structured. For example, formal collaborative engagement. In plain English, doing a workshop with Post-it notes. If you're really going to do that in a formal way, there's a lot of setup. There's a lot of theater there. There's a lot of props. There's a lot of scheduling and logistics. This is usually not a trivial engagement, especially when you've got, in this case, earlier this year, very expensive people spending all day together. So you want to make sure that that workshop is getting the bang for the buck. That is a formal collaborative engagement, best done in person. you're going to get the most value out of it in person. And then the other thing that you can't do outside of the office is hosting visitors to the office. Sure, you could do it with remote robots. Not sure that's actually bringing the true value of being in the office to your visitors. So again, this is as much theater as it is knowledge transfer. What does it have to do with innovation? Well, hopefully these partners or visitors are somehow contributing to bringing your ideas to market. Some of these activities are less structured. Informal learning and training and informal collaborative engagements. Again, in plain English, I'm sitting at my cubicle. Somebody comes over to me and says, hey, I'm having some trouble with this message I'm trying to craft, or this letter, or this drawing, or whatever. Can you help me? Sure. We go to a whiteboard. We start doodling together. Somebody else in the room, he has their ear up and they go, oh, wait, I want to listen to that too. Boom. Informal. You're working it together. You're doing it. Very, very easy to do when you're co-located. Very difficult to do informally when you're not. And then the last two don't appear to be activities at all. Some of you talked about, having lunch with people. Turns out that's a pretty key activity. We call it informal social interactions because, we're being very pseudoscientific. But trying to stay within the ABW culture, which if you look at Veldhoen stuff, some of the names they gave to their activities were quaint and amusing. But random collision shows up there as well. Both of these don't even feel like activities. And random collision is unusual. It's probably unique because they're situational. They sort of require us to be in the right place at the right time. They happen to us, not by us, even though one of the talks was how you could actually make yourself better at doing them. The fact is they happen to us. At least random collisions happen to us. And they take no effort. Every one of these other things takes some kind of effort. Random collisions happen while we're just going about the rest of our day. Like there's no effort except psychological. You need to be open to it. Hey, I'm walking down the hall, I'm talking with a friend, and I see an executive vice president coming back from lunch. I happen to be working on something that she cares about. I happen to say, hey, how's it going? Wanted to let you know, XYZ, ABC. Oh, thanks for telling me. Glad you mentioned it. There's been a shift in the blah, blah, blah. Let me know when you get back to your desk. We should talk about that. Whoa, that might have changed everything I was going to do over the next week, which I wouldn't have learned about if I hadn't taken the effort, minimal as it was, to bump into her. They are also virtually impossible to reproduce virtually. You can't do random collisions through digitally intermediated experiences. I claim. I look to this group to put me to rights on that. All right, getting close to the end here. I think about some of the situational aspects of random collisions, and the way I think about them is using this physics analogy, right? So there's a bunch of you in a startup. You're all hunkered down in a house, or you're hunkered down in a garage, or you're hunkered down in a room. You're bumping into each other all the time. There's no random collisions going on. That is constant, informal, collaborative engagement. You are all working on innovation because you're in that space doing it all the time. You're getting those ideas to market. That's the definition of innovation. But now you've grown up. And now you're in an organization that maybe has 100 folks, and maybe you've moved into multiple offices or multiple buildings or multiple floors. As those spaces grow into those multiple rooms, the opportunity to interact decreases. And the frequency of interaction between any two random folks decreases. But random collisions emerge organically. You're heading to the bathroom. Somebody else is in the hall. You bump into each other. Fabulous. Designing spaces so that those can happen more frequently than not turns out to be a thing. And one of the greatest books that I read about this is the Organization and Architecture of Innovation. And this is a case study of B&W's innovation centers back in the 80s. And so I'll send a link to that book in the chat as well. But the authors, an architect and a chemical engineer, actually talk about how they engineered and architected those buildings so that folks who might have been on different floors from one another could in fact still bump into each other in ways that would foment the kinds of ideas that need to happen in innovation centers like B&W's. Okay. Now, March 15, 2020. We are now atomized into our own rooms. We are globally, or at least nationally in our case, but globally in our case, boom. Our container is our house. The organization's container is the world, right? There is zero opportunity for random collision at this point. I'm not going to see Georgina in the hall. I'm not going to see Tracy in the lunchroom. That's gone. And that's the problem. And that's the corrosive impact of remote work on innovation. So I'm going to, before you question me, I'm going to question me and say, is that really true? Like, is that really happening? Let's do some investigation here. My claim is, unless, and I'll get to the end and I'll sort of do a reveal at the end, but my claim is that no, you cannot do random collisions remotely because they are situational in the world. They're effortless. They happen because they happen to you. The side channel comes for free. I'm walking down the hall and I see this person. It's there. I can't avoid seeing people in the space, right? And it tends to level the power dynamics, as witnessed by my executive vice president analogy or anecdote, right? But when we look at our digital life, we're instituting porta-keys from one meeting to the next. So there is no interstitial time. There is no place for us to bump into folks between meetings. We have really poor censoring, thankfully, because I certainly do not want my company censoring my private office in order to help others know really more about me and what I'm doing here. Thank you very much. No, but they do have some limited knowledge of whether I'm online, assuming I'm telling the truth and I'm not just setting myself as do not disturb. There's very few synchronous side channels, like none. I can't see Rob working and just sort of wave at him and say, hey, buddy, I have this problem, right? There's no way to know what anybody's doing other than these very poor status indicators. And as a result, if I want to talk to my executive vice president and I see that they have a red indicator, I am not going to bother them unless I think this is something worth bothering them about. And so it's a far more intentional, I have to take far more intention to bother people than I would if I happened to bump into them in the hall. So let's go back to that interaction, that little 10-minute micro reverberation that's happened to me earlier this year. I certainly could have gotten them together if we had not been in the office, right? And the answer is sure, of course. Like, he would have called me up and said, hey, I'm going to do this thing. I want to walk this through with you. I want your feedback. Great. We would have done a Teams thing. He would have done his thing. We would have gotten to that aha moment. I would have, oh, cool. I need to get you in touch with so-and-so. And I would have looked and I would have seen so-and-so was busy. And I would have said, okay. And I might have done a group chat and I might have made the introductions. But if past is prologue, having done that for the last several years, those folks didn't resolve their interest in 10 minutes. It took 3 to 4 days for that conversation to actually build up, set up a time, get through all the things for calendaring alone. So my experience has been that random collisions are not something that we can easily do in a digital domain. So knowing that there are these activities that are absolutely crucial to drive innovation, and that most of these activities are best done in real space, and knowing that our organizations may not have the will or courage to actually ask people, invite people, mandate people to come back to the office. I'm going to bookend this whole thing with another conversation. And I see a lot of stuff flying across, so maybe we can take some time to unpack that too. Thank you all for your thinking there. How might we reestablish innovation given everything that I've just talked about? What could we do? What can you tell your organization? If they care about innovation, maybe they don't. That's fine. But assuming they do, how can we help them understand, or how can we help them actually recharge the innovation engine? While you think about that, and you can post ideas in chat, I'll go back and review what's up there. Wow. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good questions. Maybe we'll talk about those instead. Um, Here's some of the things that I've come up with as I think about arguments that I need to continue to make to my leadership about what we need to do to keep the engine going, the innovation engine going. I mean, the first one's sort of brain dead. Um, let's just get back together, right? Which has been my entire thesis for this talk. So that's the obvious one. Look, you want to drive innovation? Get people back in the office, right? Oh, you don't think that's going to work? Well, let's try things like Gather.town and other ambient chat apps, which are kind of cool. If you've ever played with them, they're a little bit like Animal Crossing for the workplace. But there's these 2D layouts, and you can set up rooms, and you can do all these different things in these rooms, and play games, and have whiteboards, and have an auditorium, and all this stuff. And you can actually see, like a Harry Potter magic map, you can kind of see where everybody's at, and you can go talk to them. You can move your little avatar around in these 2D spaces, and along the way, you bump into other people. And when you bump into somebody, their video turns on, and their audio turns on, and their microphone turns on, and now you can actually have a conversation with them, which could be quite random and serendipitous and wonderful and very close to what we would do in the office. The question becomes, how does that get integrated into our usual work life? Certainly, we're not going to see something like that come out of Microsoft anytime real soon. But there's plenty of NetFlow, I think is, or TeamFlow is one of them, and Gather.town is another one, and they all work on the same basic principles, and that's kind of cool. So we were actually posing that as part of the future of work labs. Is like, okay, you want to stay digital? Great. Let's set this up instead and see how that works. And then this third one is probably closer to being real than I'm aware of. It's probably happening somewhere already in the William Gibson universe of, not equally distributed futures. But what would a digital AI system look like that would randomly collide us? How might we suddenly get randomly collided because this thing is out there and recognizes that, hey, Tristan really should be talking to Rob about that. How might that actually work, right? So this is a place where we can start to build serendipity into products. This is a place, if we really are going to live as digital nomads, where we need to get some of that serendipity baked back into our lives. Sure, maybe there's a way to overcome it. Personally, probably because of who I am, I'm biased towards the top of this chart. versus the bottom. But I think there's a number of ways that we could approach this. All right. So regardless of how an organization grapples with their innovation pipeline, one thing I'm pretty certain about, it's not going to take care of itself. It's certainly not going to take care of itself if we choose to work only remotely using the technologies that we have today. So we have to take explicit and intentional action to enable people from far-flung parts of the organization to spend time together, whether that's in a physical space or through yet unknown technology intermediation. Part of that will be to leverage the power of random collisions on innovation. And I will post all of the resources that I mentioned in chat. And now let's see what you all have been talking about. What do you all want to talk about instead? I've talked enough. Are you waving? Are you clapping? Are you raising your hand? I'm not sure what that was, Ed.
That was an attempt to clap and then turn off the clap. It seems like it's permanently on. So.
One hand clapping. Yeah. All right. Let me see if, Anne, you had some interesting provocations. Let me roll back to. So personality and openness plays a part. We have great remote collaboration between some remote team members versus other. Yes. One of the things that we, when you look at the other presentation, and maybe you recall if you were there, is that we took what's called an activity theory approach to our experimentation. And one of the things that activity theory says is, look, there's all sorts of contradictions that go on when people try to work together, and some of those have been classified. And so we want to listen for what those contradictions are that are either preventing or enabling people to get the activity done. And yes, introversion versus extroversion becomes a very interesting ingredient in terms of people's ability to interact, whether in real space or in digital space. One of the theory or hypotheses that we've been floating around is that engineering teams who are often introverts by their own admission had been coming into the labs and been signing up to take over the labs for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And we asked them why. And they said, oh my God, there is so much benefit in us actually being together and seeing each other. These are folks who are self-avowed introverts who have said, no, we need this time. We need to be together, especially these new team members who've never seen us in real space. Like, this is really critical. Even if we only do it once, twice, 3 times a year, super, super critical. And I thought, wow, that's pretty revelationary. Like, that's amazing. So yeah, absolutely personality. And the second part that I think you're intimating there, Anne, is there's a new skill, and certainly our newly hired chief person officer, who this report went to in early 23, is a huge digital remote devotee. And she was basically saying, look, there's a bunch of skills people have to learn to really work well remotely. We don't disagree. There are, getting on camera turns out to be a really important thing. Like, being on camera turns out to be really important for all y'all who aren't on camera. This is not a guilt trip. There's lots of reasons not to be on camera. And we recognize that the DEI elements here, I don't want to share my space. I do all sorts of things to make my space look different. This is a photograph of my space so that people can walk around behind me and not know that they're not on camera. So I go to great lengths to maintain my family's privacy. I get it. On the other hand, we also know that higher bandwidth in communicating remotely is better. So seeing other people's faces and reactions and that kind of stuff actually is a self-reinforcing good thing. So there are certain cultural norms we should promote if we're going to become good remote citizens. Absolutely. Absolutely true. Always wondered about the salons. Yes, well, interesting. You should bring that up. I won't go into that rabbit hole, but absolutely. The fertile ground that happens when you've put people together with a little bit of alcohol in a room that has and I don't mean to say you have to have alcohol for those of you who avoid it, but there is something that happens with that social lubricant in which that space now becomes, especially if that space is dedicated to a topic, and that the people who have been invited to come to that room are already like primed to be engaged in that topic. And so the salons of yesteryear, which I learned recently, were often driven by women. These were women-driven interactions, actually created incredible birth of new culture and new ideas and so forth. And so I've actually been talking to, hey, Ann, I've been talking to Dwayne King about how we might start a salon, restart salons in this new day and age. Yes, Ann, did you want to say something? No, you're on mute. Okay. No worries. Is random collision equal to innovation? No, it is a contributor to innovation. It is one of several activities that we believe help drive innovation. What is the cost of lost random collision to innovation, and how impactful is it? So, if we had been funded in 23, the Future of Work's task force probably would have gotten into those kinds of quantitative questions. What we were able to do in 22 was do some pretty serious surveying of our employees and build some pretty impactful models about how our employees were responding to remote only or hybrid work. There are several data points that we got just that HR has. And I think this is not peculiar to our company. So I don't think I'm sharing anything that's trade secret. But I can say with authority that in 2020, we had some very large increase in attrition of new hires over year. So if we hired 100 people or 200 people in 2019, we might have attrited 2%, 3%. In 2020, we would have attrited 25 to 30%. And the only difference is that we were working completely remotely. And so we know there's a huge impact on employee relations and culture and interaction and blah, blah, blah. The question is, to what extent is that impact seen on random collisions? Or we know what the impact on random collision is. It's zero. Like, it's zero. Unless you're invited to a main conference with a lot of 100 people in an online conference. Oh, yeah, good. On Teams, try to participate in a 100-person Teams thing. Yeah, forget it. It's driven to zero. Random collisions is driven to zero. Now, what's the impact of driving random collisions to zero on innovation? That's the question we don't have an answer to. But it's more than, I'm going to say that it is based on, again, the work I've read, this work on innovation and architecture that I'm in love with. I think my own anecdotal experience is when I go back to the office, I am in sensory overload. When I walk through the halls, I am seeing hundreds of people I have not seen in years. And as a result, I am firing. And it's like, I can barely take a step before I have to engage in something. I take a step and I have to engage with something. It's like nuts. It's horrible, right? Which is another thing Arena talks about in his talk, is we've shifted now from this, oh, it's been quiet, we get to get our work done, to suddenly information overload when we're back to the office and all these things that we have to contend with. I haven't answered your question. I don't have a good answer for it. It's a good question. The rise in commodity value and intensity, efficiency of live interaction when scarcity is introduced. So if I get what you're saying, because live interaction is so scarce, we've now introduced this interesting higher value to it. Is that kind of what you're getting to there, Rob?
Yeah. So I visit HQ 3, maybe 4 times a year for my company, and each one of those times, I mean, the amount of structured interaction, the amount of scheduling is through the roof. The understanding that we're going to get this done in this morning, this done in this afternoon, and you know what? We're going to be having lunches together. We're going to be having all the lunches together. We're going to be having all the dinners. And if we say happy hour, that motherfucker's going till 1 a.m.
And it's enforced happiness. It's enforced happiness.
No, everything is like, hey, who wants to come to lunch, or who wants to come to dinner, or who wants to be out until 1 a.m. And there is always somebody that's going to say yes. And the work gets done, and it's in about that.
Right.
About
So what you're saying is the preciousness of time together suddenly makes those times more impactful, or economically more valuable, because everybody realizes we don't get to do this every day. So we're going to make it count when we're together. And that's actually not bad. Arena makes an interesting counterpoint that says, yeah, we're not really contending with that quite as well as we should. Like, we really should be preparing people for that, so that when they come in, they realize that they're going to be productive, but not in the way they've been productive, and get them reoriented to this. He said it's coming to every organization, and organizations aren't really contending with it. So again, I invite you to listen to his talk, because he's talking about that. I'm going to go to your next one about how might we establish a culture that supports remote innovation. And I'm going to continue to push on the activities that we know drive innovation, and how difficult it is to do those activities remotely. And we saw it at Intel 10 years ago, and it is not a technology problem. This is not a technology problem. This is, until we can actually increase the bandwidth of our interactions digitally, and really get to close to what it's like to be in the real world, where our bandwidth is 100x, 200x, 1,000x more than what it is through this Brady Bunch, Hollywood Squares pigeonhole. Until we can actually make that happen, it's going to be really, really challenging. So we attempted to do things with Oculus. We said, hey, let's get everybody on VR and see if we can create virtual environments where we can work together, right? And we were looking at this ambient chat thing. We were trying to see what technologies we could enable to reduce the intermediation problem that digital technologies introduce. And it turns out they don't exist yet. I'm not saying there isn't a technical solution. I'm just saying I haven't seen. I open it up to all y'all. Maybe y'all have seen other technical solutions that can help increase the bandwidth for that fluidity that is so much a part of innovation. I'm going to keep going. I have to believe that remote work created more text-based conversations that can be harvested than vocal conversation. Well, let me say you this. All of our conversations are being harvested. It doesn't matter whether they're vocal or textual or video. Everything is surveilled. Everything is being gobbled up, and everything is being analyzed. So unless you're in person out in a park with all your phones turned off, you can pretty much assume you're being surveilled. So yes, we have a lot more data that these folks are ingesting, for good, bad, or indifferent. Host cross-department open spaces where you can Yes, I didn't mention that in the talk, even though it was in my notes, but one of the antidotes to the siloed organization is that leaders say, hey, let's have a lunch and learn. And all the leaders come and go and have this lunch and learn. And somebody presents and everybody goes, oh, that's cool. I didn't know you were working on that, and blah, 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 blah. Yes, I would say, as many of us know who go to conferences, the content of the conference is 20% of the value, and it's the bumping into and the networking that is the 80% of the value. So even in those cross organizational opportunities, people are going there ostensibly for the share out, but really one of the great benefits is, God, I haven't seen you, Julie. I haven't seen you in a year. What's going on with you, right? And boom, boom, boom. Those are the connections that actually create the basis for a lot of this innovation. That's not to say that these are artificial or shouldn't be done. I think it's absolutely critical. Innovation days, like Intel shut down for a day, and everybody participated in a day-long innovation day. Great. We should do that. Hackathons, design sprints. Sure, we should be doing that stuff. It's absolutely great. That's as far removed from random collision as you can get. It's not at all the same. And it costs a lot. They are hugely costly, whereas random collisions are pretty free. Let's see. I like the idea of an AI agent that drops by and asks me some questions about my work, some probing questions, maybe with some humor. Then the AI agent could bring me connections. It thinks, yeah, see what I'm telling you is it doesn't have to ask you shit. It knows exactly what you're doing all the time, and it knows your humor. So it's going to match you up with somebody who's complementary to your humor because per Ed's, I think it was Ed, whoever programs is tonight, basically said, gee, I think we're harvesting a lot of text. No, we're harvesting everything. Everything. This is being harvested. My voice is being harvested. So yes, Tristan, absolutely. It's no longer interrogatories. It's harvesting. And then all of a sudden, somebody's going to pop up somehow, magically in this new technology window. This is, hey, Tristan, you got a second? I think I have something. And it's like magical. Wow. Yes. Thank you. I will stop what I'm doing to talk to you because that's so important to me. And apparently it's important to you because our AI overlord figured that out for us. Yay. That's fantastic. Right. I really do think that that's not an unexpected. I don't think that's a science fiction story. It's a science fiction story today. I don't think it's going to be a science fiction story 5 to 10 years from now. Frightening to me as it might be. I like the potential of an AI proposal. If you can successfully map those nodes in your previous slides and company provided alcohol. Absolutely. Company providing alcohol, absolutely important. But I like the potential of AI proposal if you can. Yes. But here's the deal. So when I went through some management training, thank you, Intel, at Harvard, thank you, Intel, one of the things we were talking about was the network graphs, right? And we had to map our network graphs. Like we had to dump, that was back when LinkedIn let you dump all your connections. And so we could actually pull our network graph off of LinkedIn. And it told us what those connections were to each other. So we could actually see how moribund and root bound our own connections were. Were we only talking to a bubble? Were all of our connections only talking to each other? Or were our connections actually talking to folks that weren't talking to each other? And one of the things they were telling us as strategic leaders is build more of those bridging connections and fewer of those bonding connections. Like have good bonding connections, but have a lot more bridging connections because that's how you're going to, and Arena says the same thing. This is how you're going to improve your career. This is how you're going to get promoted, right? Is through those bridging connections. I know we're at time. I could go on all night. You know how to reach me.
Yeah.
If you want that paper from Veldhoen, reach me. You got all these links. Hopefully this has been both entertaining and informative.
It's a real clap there.
Yay!
All right. Thank you so much, Leo. Really, really appreciate it. This is really great. So we will make this video available. We'll try to do it fairly soon, but please look for it in our website, kaifu.org. So with that, I hope, especially those of you on the East Coast, this is really late for you. Thank you for hanging out here. So
yeah, Zane, so nice of you to hang out.
Good night, everyone.
Gonna have to
All right. See you next month.
Good night, everybody.
Bye. Bye.